Oh my gosh, I was drifting. Trolling to the next dock and there was one left on it. I believe that's a largemouth. It is. That's a largemouth. I was trolling away to the next dock. Caught a decent largemouth. One of those baits that some people's confidence bait, or one of those baits that some people just have no confidence in, is a jig. I know, like a normal Arky jig, one of my favorite things to throw. When I first started fishing, I just never caught any on a jig. I had no confidence in it, just couldn't catch fish on it. And what I did, my first time ever learning to fish a jig, is I took everything out of the boat when I was about 14, 13 years old. Went fishing with 2 jig boxes and just learned to fish a jig, just only that. A jig is very similar to, you know, you fish at the same places you'd fish a creature bait, things like that, but it's a little more versatile, I guess you'd say. Like I'm fishing docks with it today, and it's a great bait to skip, but also you can swim it, you can do a lot of different things with it versus like a creature bait, you know, you kind of flip under there and drag it. The jig just has a little bit different look than a creature bait. But a jig is a big fish bait. If it gets bit, a lot of times it's a good one, and it works pretty much everywhere in the country. So I keep my jig box pretty simple when it comes to what jigs I carry, what jigs I throw. I throw like an Arky style head. I made one with greenfish tackle, but just an Arky style, like, you know, I call it an all-purpose jig because you can skip it, you can kind of drag it on the bottom, you do whatever you want, but it's just an Arky style head. It's kind of rounded, but it skips all right. It's just simple with a decent size hook in it. But I only carry, me personally, now you'll hear different things from everybody, but me personally, I only carry 2 sizes jigs. I carry a 1/2 ounce and a 3/8 ounce. And I would say I probably throw a 1/2 more and put a larger trailer if I want to fall slower, but sometimes a 3/8 is a good option too. But probably one of the easiest baits to skip docks to put where you want to is a 1/2 ounce Arky jig. And you can vary your trailers to be able to skip it better, be able to cast it where you want to better. A Z-Crawl Junior, which is what I got on my jig right here, is probably one of the easiest to cast jig trailers. Chunk trailers, I know you hear from a lot of Carolina guys like me, a chunk trailer is an awesome jig trailer, but they're not as easy to cast. They spin a lot when you throw them, you get line twists, they don't skip as well. If you want to skip your jig really well, if you put a creature style bait such as a Z-Crawl Junior or some bait like that, it skips a lot better. It slides on the water, because a jig's a really, really skippable bait, but with the wrong trailer, it's not. If you get frustrated skipping it, a lot of times it comes down to trailer selection. Little spot. This is right on the front of the dock. The cool thing about this dirty water, a lot of times spotted bass, especially in the fall, they kind of roam around on bait. But when you get this dirty water like this, it'll put a lot of them up on the bank, kind of like largemouth get, up there shallower, where they're a little more easier to catch. When you're fishing docks, especially with a jig, a lot of your fish, so most of your bites, when you're fishing docks, when you really want to kind of pay attention, they'll either be when you skip under the dock, or really on anything. When your bait first lands in there, they'll catch it on the fall almost and have it, or you'll let it hit the bottom, you'll give it a couple hops, and then when you go to reel it up, they'll hit it a lot. It's kind of, if you notice, when I fish my jig around docks or wood or anything like that, I get that initial fall, and then I give it a couple, you know, drags and pulls, however I think they want it that day, if they want it aggressive or not. And then when I get ready to reel it back, I kind of speed it up and then slow it down almost every time I reel it back. Because what happens a lot is it kind of takes off, fish will chase it, and then you'll slow it down, they'll catch it and eat it. And it's kind of one of those things, you can't see them doing it, but you kind of got to imagine that a fish is looking at it every time you go to retrieve your bait. So I'm catching a lot of spotted bass out here. So first thing I always do is trim my weed guard a little bit when I put a new jig on, just to make it, you know, even with the tip of the hook. So it still works, but it's not quite as thick. And then I'm catching a lot of spotted bass here, so I'm gonna make this skirt, shrink it down just a little bit. Because spotted bass tend to nip at it. So make it a little bit smaller. I got a little carried away on that one, but I shrunk it down just a little bit, just to make it a little bit smaller profile before I put my crawl on it. That one ate it while I was reeling back, just like I said earlier. It's a little spot, but went to reel back and he was probably looking at it, and then he ate it. So I've been throwing a 1/2 ounce black and blue jig for a while. It's always good to kind of keep your options open, because I've been throwing a 1/2 ounce black and blue, and that's what I got bit on the other day, and they didn't seem to want it today, and I went down to a 3/8 ounce. Switched to like a dark green color, and seems like I'm getting a few more bites now on that. So you want to keep your options open. But usually it's not, I'm not a big color specific guy, but I think the going from a 1/2 ounce to 3/8 probably made a big difference. I like a 1/2 because it's easier to cast. You can put it where it's more difficult to put this 3/8, but 3/8 is still very castable. But I prefer to throw a 1/2 ounce jig. But sometimes the 3/8 to fall, especially in this dirty water, it probably lets them see it a little bit better. One of the reasons a jig is so good around, you know, docks and shallow cover lakes is because it skips well. A creature bait or Texas rig is kind of hard to skip sometimes because your bait comes down or your weight slides up a little bit. But a jig is like one of the best baits to skip under this stuff. But when it comes to skipping a jig, obviously the right rod makes a difference, and like I mentioned, the trailer. But also kind of how you aim makes a big difference. It's when you're skipping a dock, I see a lot of people that I'm like, you know, I take fish docks and they have never done it before and they're trying to skip. Well, they actually force their bait to skip. And what I mean by that is, whereas, you know, when you skip a rock, you throw it and you're kind of trying to hit the water and bounce it, which is the same thing you're doing with jig, but really you want to pick the slot you want to put your jig in. And you're actually, if your jig doesn't ever hit the water, that's fine. Just throw it really low. Don't force skip it at the water. You want to aim where you want the jig to land, not before it, because if you do that, what ends up happening is it hits the water, plows, and it's stuck. So when you're skipping holes on a dock, you always want to skip, you always want to make a low cast aiming where your bait's going to go. Don't worry if it skips or not. If it doesn't skip, great. It slid right under there and went where you wanted to. But it will, if it gets low and skips, then that's fine too. If you aim short, you're gonna land short. When it comes to fishing a jig, I use my do-all rod. It's a 7.3 medium heavy, and I like it because this is what I like to skip with. When you're throwing a jig, even if I'm throwing it laydowns or whatever like that, I still come by docks or come by underhanging bushes and stuff, so I need to be able to skip it. And I personally skip with my do-all. If you're a shorter person, I would use my little skipper rod rather than my do-all. It's a little bit shorter rod, and it just allows you to present that bait a little bit better if you can't deal with this 7.3, because it's a long rod. My reel is just a Gravity G7. I use a 7-1 real fast. When you're fishing a jig, I mean, you want to get it in there. If you don't get a bite, get it back and get your next cast back out quick. So 7-1 ratio or faster, I just prefer 7-1 is essential. And like I said earlier, jigs, I keep it pretty simple when it comes to jigs, or shallow jigs. We're not talking football jigs or finesse jigs or any of that weird stuff. We're just talking about your typical arky dock style jig. And I keep it pretty simple. I carry in my boat a 3/8 and 1/2 ounce in green pumpkin, which I got here, which was the most successful for me today, black and blue, and then black, brown, and amber, just another darker color. And I kind of feel like those three colors, they imitate everything, and if they're biting a jig, they will bite that. But just keep in mind when it comes to jig trailers, I've done a video on jig trailers before you can look at, but the more full-size profile trailers that you thread up the hook, they're always gonna skip better. The chunk trailers are really effective, fish bite them really well, but they're not as easy to skip. So I prefer a Z-Crawl Junior or a Speed Crawl when I'm doing any type of skipping, but it's more about how you present it, and that trailer really, really helps you present it. And I think chunk or this, most of the time they'll bite either, and I can get the bait where I need to better with that crawl style trailer. But that setup is just pretty simple. But the key with jig fishing is confidence. It's one of those things that works just as well as a Texas rig, but I know if you're like me, when I was fishing, when I first started off fishing tournaments and things like that, I'd throw a Texas rig all day, catch fish, a baby brush hog, a Z-crawl, or anything like that, I'd catch fish, but I just didn't have confidence in that jig. But I recommend taking all your stuff out of the boat, getting your jig box in there, where you don't have any options to do anything else, and just fish a jig. And once you start getting bid on it, it'll be one of your favorite baits in the future.